Welcome back to Into the Mystery. Today, Rishika and I are discussing the dark night of the soul and having a really profound conversation about what it is and the intensity and significance of these passages that we go through. I think this will speak to many of those who are on the conscious path of growth and expansion because we all face the dark nights. So have a listen and enjoy. And if you want to connect with us on Patreon or perhaps sign up to be a donor, we would really appreciate that. Look for those details in the text.
So today we're going to explore the idea of the dark night of the soul. And I think maybe before we get too deeply into some of the details, it might be useful to delineate the difference between what's commonly thought of to be the dark night of the soul, which I think, outside of spiritual circles, that term is used a lot to describe sort of a very low point in someone's life where maybe they're contemplating suicide or many things have gone wrong in their experience. And um, it indicates maybe a deep depression. Which can be part of the spiritual version of a dark night of the soul. But in our work, I think we're talking about a much more complex and multi layered experience that every person going through an awakening process is probably going to encounter at some point.
Inevitably. I mean, I don't see anybody who could go through the maturation of awakening realization without many dark nights of the soul. I just don't even know how it would be even possible.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I mean, that would imply that for a person to go through the maturation process and not experience the dark night of the soul would mean that they have no resistance and no conflicts in their consciousness, which would mean they're already enlightened
Yeah,
completely.
that's a
And
good
so
point.
there would be no necessity for a process, right?
Right, right. It's a good thing to remember when you're in the middle of one. And I think it's important to mention too, you alluded to the fact that there's more than one. It's not a one-off deal. I would even venture to say that perhaps there's some version of the Dark Knight that comes with each sort of deepening phase of development.
That's one of the things I really wanted to hone in on in this
Mm,
conversation. I would agree with that because I would agree that the dark night of the soul comes in miniature form
mhm,
each time we're having like some kind of small integration of something. And it comes in major form when we're sort of our realization is leaping to another dimension of consciousness.
mhm, mhm,
So there are, several major passages that are significant and usually long, like they last a while. And then
mhm,
there are these small ones that are like little gateways, and both have their own place and significance, and both can be difficult. Um, Usually, the transitions between dimensions are more significant and longer lasting, though.
mhm.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about transitions between dimensions, which dimensions are you referring to?
Well, our consciousness has different dimensions to it. And so, I mean, one easy way to talk about that would be to talk about it in terms of the chakras. That
Mhm,
each time that our consciousness is migrating to another chakra, it will bring into consciousness new insights, new experiences, new levels of realization, new knowledge, capital K, and also with it, new conflicts that are deeper, more primal to the human experience.
mm,
And so, like awakening at the level of the heart, for example, is going to bring up a lot of different heart centered conflicts, relational conflicts, for example, or conflicts around self worth and value, different things like this, right?
mhm,
Whereas an awakening at the level of the spiritual I, the Anya, um, will bring about a whole different set of experiences and conflicts around, well, for example, one's orientation around what's real, um,
mhm, mhm,
and the difference between intellectual knowledge and true knowing. And so, as each of those transitions really is taking place in our experience, it's going to bring about those dimensional shifts are going to bring about really significant material to work through, and often with it, a significant dark night of the soul.
mhm. Yeah. I'm sort of like hearkening back to my own experiences with this over the years. if we sort of harken back to the lower chakras, Muladhara, survival, those issues, there's a moment, or at least I remember a moment from my own process where I fully encountered the reality of my own impending death in a way that I had never contemplated it before in my life, or never really kind of experienced I don't even know what the word is, but the fact that that's a real thing, like, oh my God, holy shit, someday I'm going to die. And it shattered my sense of sort of like the assumption that I had that life would simply continue. And of course it does, in a way, but that was almost like having a bomb dropped on your head, not to, make a war illusion really, but there's something so profoundly disorienting and unsettling about it that you feel as though like the earth is literally falling out from under you. Um, and then moving up, the relational thing, the idea that from the second chakra, if we're talking about Svadhisthana now, this idea that people can't complete you. You've always been seeking connection, and yet, oh my goodness, there's this sudden shock of the understanding of your ultimate aloneness. Not just on the planet, not just in your, like sort of the circumstances of your own life, but period. We are simply alone as one in this world, and that's a pretty shattering thing until you've integrated it, and so on upward. We get up to chakra number 3, Manipura, the personal agency and will, and this idea that everything I've been told to strive for in my life isn't real, or isn't as satisfying, or isn't a marker of anything that I thought it would be, etc.
Mhm.
So I don't know how to sum that up, but
Can I try?
please.
Not sum it up necessarily, but the thing that occurred to me as you were speaking was th- an important part of the dark night of the soul, which is that with these transitions, there are crises of identity. That's a big part of the dark night of the soul. It's a crisis of identity.
Right, right. It's a huge piece of egoic identification that's being dissolved, discarded, left behind, and
Integrated.
well, yeah, but at the same time, what's the dynamic I'm looking for here? Well, we always use that metaphor of free falling, because every time it seems like every time a little piece of your identity proves to be unreal, we have less and less of a reference point to align with, or to orient ourselves toward, and it feels like a death. In fact, oh, this brings up something I wanted to say earlier. Um, I was raised Catholic, and Psalm 23? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death,
Mm,
I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. And it always puzzled me, the shadow of death. It's like, why is it the shadow of death? Why wouldn't it just be the valley of death? And it kind of dawned on me at some point in the last few years that, like, oh, they're talking about ego death here. This is actually, to me, that describes the dark night of the soul, is we're passing
mm,
through this transition in which the ego is dying, and it is so traumatic to our sense of self that it feels like an actual death of the physical body on some level.
yeah.
And when you're in it, it feels like it's never going to end. It feels like this is just where you're stuck now forever, that life has no meaning, everything, I have no meaning. And that is sheer terror.
Mhm.
And the challenge then becomes, how do I sit in this emptiness, in this aloneness, in this absence of meaning, in this nothingness, in this free fall, and not, I don't know, disappear.
Yeah, right. Well, we are going to disappear. Not as we might imagine, but we will disappear. And, I like that you brought the psalm into this because a piece that dawned on me as you were reciting it, and I love that one, is the valley of the shadow of death is significant in that death casts a shadow, and it's the shadow that we're afraid of.
Mm,
Death itself is no problem. There's no threat. There's no harm in dying, ego death
mm,
or otherwise.
hmm.
But the shadow of death is where the fright exists. It's in that
Oh,
darkness
yeah.
where we can't see what
Hmm.
death really is, or
Mm.
what the impending emptiness or dissolution might be. And it's in the shadow where we get frightened.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really excellent point.
Mm,
How poetic. How poetic is
mm.
that? How perfect is
It's
that wording?
it's beautiful, yeah.
Yeah.
And in the valley, not on the mountaintop, the valley,
Right,
the
right.
lowest.
It does feel that way too. It does feel like you're sort of being cloaked in shadow when you go through this passage.
Yes.
Um,
I mean, it can even feel to an individual that they are being surrounded by the presence of evil at times, especially with very certain integrations. It
mm,
can feel very dark, not only dark as in like the lights are off and I don't know what's going on, but dark as in there's something out there threatening me.
mm, yeah, I haven't personally experienced that, I don't think, but the feeling of being obliterated, which I guess could come at, the agency of some dark being. But yeah, that obliteration feels awfully frightening.
Yeah. Isn't there something in the Bible that I'm trying to remember where this comes from, where it speaks of God coming as a thief in the night? Do you remember that?
No, I don't know that one. I mean, I've heard the phrase "thief in the night." You sure not? It
Yeah.
isn't Shakespeare or something?
I'm not positive. I thought it was biblical, but I'm failing to recall where it may be right now. But it's a very interesting notion of thinking of the divine as a thief that comes in the night. Thief that comes in the night is usually something you're pretty terrified of. You want to lock the doors. But if
Mm-hmm.
it's the divine that comes to steal something from you in the middle of the night, there's something glorious about that. There's something very beautiful about that. So there's something about opening to these dark nights, opening to that thievery of the divine that's a really profound part of this all.
That's always the challenge, isn't it? The willingness, the willingness to open, the willingness to experience whatever appears to be threatening, whatever feels threatening. And then we almost, inevitably we find that it's not nearly as frightening as we thought it was going to be.
Exactly. As the Course in Miracles states, nothing real can be threatened and
And
nothing
nothing
unreal
unreal exists.
exists.
Yeah.
Nothing real can be threatened. If we can keep that in our consciousness when we're in the middle of the threat, the dark night, the fear, the terror, the confusion, the apathy, the disorientation that comes as one is awakening, it's a huge support to remember that.
Yeah. I recall feeling like I was going insane a number of times, and I always reminded myself, 'cause I've heard you say more than once, no, no, you're not going insane, you're actually going sane. And isn't that the funniest thing about it is, we don't realize how deeply deluded we've been until, those pieces start to fall off, and then there's this feeling that you want to put the pieces back together in a new way or something. And so I think that's part of the struggle too, is like, how do I rearrange my ideas about myself? How do I rearrange my reference points in such a way that I feel stable again, that I feel safe? And there's no way to do that. And so it's this process of getting ever more comfortable with discomfort, ever more comfortable with the free fall, with, the disintegration, and ultimately coming to, I mean, there is a point where you're coming to terms with the fact that you don't actually exist in the way that you thought you did. I mean,
Yeah.
not to scare people, but that's a thing. It's like, I'm
Yeah.
not who I thought I was. I'm not anything except this experience right now.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. There's uh, the fear of going insane is one of the really significant dark nights of the soul. And it can be a short lived or a long lived experience because one has been conditioned so deeply by this world and by society that one feels that they know what's real. And as they awaken to these different dimensions of their being, they're introduced to realities and truths that don't fit with what they've been conditioned with. And there's a great disparity in their consciousness between what they've learned is real and what they're discovering is real. And it leads one to want to, well, to necessarily question their sanity. And it reminds me of the statement that sanity in the eyes of men is insanity in the eyes of God,
Yeah.
and sanity in the eyes of God is insanity in the eyes of men. And there's something really significant about that because you're quite right. Much of our life force is spent trying to reinforce and reify that false center, that false self.
Mm.
And it's when we undergo a process of awakening, it's going to dissolve. And our resistance to that dissolving is really where many of the dark nights of the soul happen.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and maybe to expand a little bit on the idea of being alone in the world, this isolation that comes along with our development, because so much of our sense of self comes with or is derived from what is reflected back to us from our family and friends and society in general. And as you begin to realize how insane that is, that's just another set of reference points that's falling away. There's no validation coming back to you. Um, we indeed will lose friends sometimes, or lose a relationship, or find that the way we've oriented ourselves in the world in terms of career or other things are meaningless or no longer needed. And so all of those little touchstones, all of those little places where I would say hello to a neighbor, for example, and perhaps we have a certain kind of conversation every day, and that's part of my identity. That's part of my expectation of who I am, and that ceases to be a thing for whatever reason. That's a part of myself that I'm not seeing anymore. So it's not just my sense internally of who I am, but it's what I'm accustomed to being reflected back at me that's now
Yeah.
changing. And people may even be suspicious or angry that you're developing in a different direction now. So there's a huge
Yeah.
basket of stuff here.
And that particular integration refers back to that piece you spoke of earlier, the primordial aloneness, because
Yeah.
as we awaken to the aloneness, the oneness of consciousness, being, our divine nature, we can't look to the world or other people to reflect back to us what we are anymore. And
Right.
that's
Right.
profoundly disorienting to the social part of our being that
Hmm.
wants to know who I am by looking to what others have to reflect back. It's
Yeah.
profoundly
Exactly.
upsetting and disorienting. So
You know what?
that's
Oh, go ahead. You can finish.
no, that's it. That's it. I'm done.
You know what I found myself, I don't know if troubled by is the right way to explain this. One of the most freeing dynamics of doing this work I have found is the idea that I don't have to be beholden to anyone but God. I don't have to perform in any particular way to please another person. I don't have to save them. I don't have to fix their problems, etc. Um, that I can make my own choices. And, there's a profound empowerment that comes with that. At the same time, the responsibility that comes with that can feel almost uh, so monumental that it can't be dealt with because I was so used to being small at the demands of other people and then letting that like kind of uh, be the basis of my self-esteem. That once that's gone, now how do I conduct myself? Um,
Yes.
so there's this like I've got this life force energy and I don't yet know what to do with that because it used to be diverted into other people, like showing up for my family or for my kids or for my job or, for the person I've always done certain favors for or something. And that's gone. All of those markers of my goodness, my sense of self-esteem are just like obliterated. Now what?
Yes. Well, this goes very, very much into the dark night of the will, the dark night of the
Mm-hmm.
soul connected to our will in the third chakra, because it speaks to this question of autonomy. Who's in
Mm-hmm.
charge of me,
Mm-hmm.
and who's responsible here? And uh, what we see in the individuals, what we see in most individuals, and this is specific to the third chakra, is there's a great desire for freedom and autonomy and a great resistance to being responsible. But
Mm-hmm.
you can't be free without responsibility.
Right, right.
And so that realization, that sort of dichotomy is what presents itself
Mm-hmm.
in that dark night where one wants to be free, one wants to be autonomous, one wants their own sovereignty as a spiritual being, and yet resists it because of what
Mm-hmm.
it means for being actually responsible and not. Because most of us literally, like, we're living in the world as children who want to be taken care of. That's
Right.
why a government or a society can easily tell you what to think and what to do, because it's just easier to be a child feeling like you're being cared for by a
Mm-hmm.
parent. Very few people want real sovereignty. They want the
Mm-hmm.
freedom, but they want freedom to go do what they want or play the
Mm-hmm.
way they want or have pleasure and comfort the way they want. But to have real sovereignty means being responsible, like
Right.
really responsible, like truly
Right.
spiritually responsible. And so that's a conflict that arises right there in the dark
Mm-hmm.
night of the will.
Yeah, yeah. And then in the loss of those messages of approval from other people, that kind of constant feedback. Last week in our episode on technology, we talked a little bit about dopamine hits. Those go away because I'm not getting a good job from, my boss, or I'm not getting a whatever gratitude I'm getting from the friend I did a favor for, those sorts of things. I'm having to make very mature and sometimes complex choices consistently in order to stay true to my own practice, my own path, and stay true to what hopefully the divine wants from me, um, while foregoing that approval from the people around me.
Yes.
Giving up those little hits of approval and joy, and which isn't the true joy that we're after, but there's a certain comfort and safety in that, and a lot of people, myself included, I think, settled for staying very small for a long time because that we hoped that was enough. It turned out for our soul it wasn't enough, but
Yep.
there's that,
Yep.
I guess, fantasy that it would be.
Yeah, it's one of the most disturbing elements of the Dark Knight is when we realize how much we are addicted to the narcissistic supplies, getting
Oh yeah.
hits, getting
Yeah.
hits, getting reward from the world that will tell us we're good, that we have value, that we're important.
Mhm.
And that's where the rubber really hits the road, so to speak, because most individuals, when it really comes down to it, are too terrified to give that up
Yeah.
because it means being alone.
Yep.
It means really being alone. It means deriving your sense of worth and value not from anything reflected to you, but from your true design.
Yeah. Yep. That's hard. That's it's so
That's why
hard.
it's a dark night, baby. That's why it gets dark. It's hard.
It's just me here, me and nobody else.
I'm alone in the dark. I'm scared. There's a boogeyman in the closet.
Well, and then when you realize that everybody else is you too, and I mean you're really truly alone as everything, but you're alone.
Well, that's not dark anymore. That gets bright. But
No, I was
yes,
going to say it's a beautiful thing, but
yes, yes.
intimidating, I guess, when you first encounter it.
Yeah, it's not a part of our conditioning. That's for sure. It's kind of cool. We're exploring some of the without even naming them. We're exploring some of the specific integrations that people go through, and it would almost be where I wish St. John of the Cross's book, Dark Night of the Soul, is a brilliant and beautiful book, and there is a great deal detailed there. I almost like the idea if I could just imprint a book from all the things I have in my mind. Someone should make an app for that. You just imprint everything you have in your mind into a book form, and um, I'd like a book to exist. Maybe I'll write one day about the very specific elements of the Dark Knight, the psychological elements, because that's what we're
Mhm.
sort of talking about in a lot of ways. We're talking about identity, sense of self-value, sense of authority and autonomy and sovereignty. We're talking about the survival drive. These are the very specific nights that we pass through, and they each have their own. There's like a specific feeling to each one. There's a
Yeah, yeah.
specific kind of, and when the integration actually dawns and becomes stable,
Mhm.
we can see exactly why that dark night was necessary, exactly what it was that we were going through
Yeah, yeah.
to get there. And but in the midst of it, it's like the Christians say, you're in the cloud of unknowing. It's
Mhm.
dark. It's dark, and you don't know where you're at. You're disoriented,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that's why I always reassert that we need teachers and we need teachings. Nobody, as much as some New Age authorities say you wake up on your own, no, you don't,
Mhm.
because no ego has within it all of the necessary knowledge to navigate
Yeah.
through
Yep.
experience. No ego has that,
Right.
none. And that's why when you're in the middle of the dark, like, you need a good friend who can
Mhm.
say, look, it's okay, you're in the dark, I know where you're at, I've been there before. You're going to bump your foot on this and you're going to bump your elbow on that, but at the end, if you just listen carefully and stay earnest and trust
And
yourself and
trust,
trust
trust.
this process, there's going
Mhm.
to be a door at the end of this room, and when you open it, it's going to be bright. Trust me.
That's
Yeah.
beautiful. I'll remember that next time it comes up. Hey, can we talk about anger on the Dark Knight a little bit? Because I
Let's.
distinctly remember an angry phase where it had to do mostly with having been deceived. I felt like I had been so deeply deceived my entire life, and I'm in my 50s, so we're talking half a century of deception. not just deceived, but I felt I had been exploited, that my life force energy had been diverted in service of things that I did not agree with or believe in.
Yes.
But because I was still dependent on the approval from the outside world, um, I bought into it, or I at least tried to get approval from the system that
Mm.
was oppressing me. And when I saw that fully, I was so pissed off. I mean,
Yes.
just days of anger.
Yes. Well, that's a really significant part of the breakdown and dissolution of the false self is we realize that we have fundamentally betrayed our true nature
Yes.
in order to have to win favor in this
Hmm.
world. And it started mostly with we betrayed ourselves in order to be liked, loved, and approved of by our
Hmm.
parents.
Yeah.
That's the start of it.
Yeah.
And when that dawns in our consciousness, it gives rise to such anger
Hmm.
and rage at what's been done. And it feels that it's been done to us, which it has in a way, unconsciously. But what's even more disturbing is that we've done it to ourselves, and
Right.
and we're
Right.
we're we're like rageful at ourselves for doing
Hmm.
it.
Yeah, and I think
Um,
on some level you actually can feel that you understood that at the time. Like there was some level of us that knew. I can think back to moments in my very early childhood where, I come from a dysfunctional family, so there was all kinds of emotional stuff I won't go into, but it was painful and disorienting. And I remember that there was a part of myself that knew that it wasn't right, and that was just completely bewildered by the way I was being treated, because there's that wisdom level, I think, of our being. I mean, we have a kosha that's the wisdom kosha. And it eventually, I remember that over time, as I struggled to please people, to not get mad at me, that got kind of buried. And that
yes.
was a big part of the anger too, because the
Yep.
self betrayal, I was aware of it on some level, but it was down there so deep I didn't see
Yep.
it until much, much later.
Yep. Yeah. And yes, exactly. And what we start to see as an integration that these dark nights that include anger and rage always circle back to our integration of our will, our sovereignty, our strength and courage, and power.
Hmm.
And and honestly, this is where much of our world is like we're in a collective dark night of the soul right now because
Yeah.
there's a deep, deep confusion in the world around the feelings of powerlessness that people have and how
Mm.
to reclaim it. And
Hmm.
mostly what people are trying to do is they're trying to reclaim power externally and it's not working. And they think it's the right movement, but it's actually creating more disaster.
Yeah.
So that's a side tangent. I'm sorry. But
No, that's okay. I think that's very valid actually, because we're affected by all of those things. We're affected.
yes,
I mean, the world itself is a macrocosm of what's going on within us. Um,
precisely.
yeah, so you can feel that tension, even if
Yeah,
you're not directly involved in something related to it.
right.
Yeah.
Right. Which is, that's not to go off on too much of a side tangent, but that's why I have a lot of opposition to Marxist thinking because it always breeds that I am powerless in a world full of people who have power over me.
Hmm.
And
Mm, yeah.
it gets into a very destructive mentality because when people feel powerless, as we've covered in previous episodes, when people feel powerless, they act to reclaim power. And
Hmm.
in that act, they're actually acting out their powerlessness, not power. They're not acting out power, because when power is integrated, it has no need to do any
Exactly.
of those destructive things.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to the point is, if we look at that in the microcosmic as something that goes on in the individual. As an individual ego, I walk around feeling powerless. I feel small. I've
Hmm.
betrayed myself. I've learned to be something I'm not. And then there's a certain point where it's like, fuck you all.
Right.
Fuck
Right.
this world. I'm fucking tired of this shit.
Yeah.
You know? And
Yep.
that's a necessary place to pass through. It's not a good place to end up. I'll tell you
Right.
that.
Right.
But it's a necessary place to pass through
Hmm.
for this integration of our sovereignty, our will, our sense of true power.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because especially if you're, on the yogic path, if you're a yogi, we're taught not to, feel that way toward the world. We don't want to say fuck you to the world. We're supposed to just sort of like blissfully accept everything as being beautiful, and that is not going to serve you as you're going through that particular transition.
Right. It's
So
like,
thank
good
you for
luck with that.
validating that, because I remember feeling some guilt around that when I was hating on the world quite a bit, and
Yeah. No, this is
yeah.
the difference. This is why I teach Tantra and not some of the typical yogic models because in Tantra, there's room for that anger to be
Yeah.
there and be integrated. Whereas in the typical yogic approach, or let's say the Western insane version of such, it's like, no, you shouldn't be angry. You should be peaceful and calm all the time. That's the
Mhm.
yogic way. No,
Right.
that's not really real or true at all.
Mhm. Mhm. Yep. I can attest to that for sure. But that anger, that fuck you to the world, that becomes, when it's integrated, that becomes the power that you can stand in and feel secure. Not, you
Yes.
don't necessarily have to deploy it. It's
Yes.
just there underpinning your self
Yeah.
understanding, I guess. Yeah.
And I can really relate to this. I mean, I've spent a good deal of my life with a struggle with anger and a struggle
Mhm.
around power. And I remember even in my teen years listening to Pantera, listening to Rage Against the Machine, and feeling the surge of energy that was sort of, for me at the time, it became, a kind of iconoclastic, kind of against society movement. And that was a very important initiation to go through as a young man and
Mm.
feel this anti-society movement emerge in
Mhm.
me. At the time, it was very immature. So I was angry and I was atheistic and I was, a little bit more, I leaned into that sort of attitude of this all needs to be destroyed.
Mhm.
But it was a very important thing for me to go through in order to have my eyes open and not just be a blind follower to
Yeah.
things. And I think whatever, at whatever point a person comes into that, they come into this recognition that, like you said earlier, we are being duped. It's not like anybody's out there doing it to us. It's an
Mhm.
ethos. It's a
Yeah, it's a
collective
collective
attitude.
delusion, yeah.
Yeah. But we are being duped.
Yeah. And furthermore, there are people who are, being rewarded for duping us. um Anyway,
Yeah,
that's a
there are
whole other.
vested yeah, there are vested
Yeah,
interests
yeah.
in
I
doing.
mean, there's there because there could be. Oh, it's so funny because it's almost like there's a collective, not almost like, I think it is like, there's a collective ego that wants to maintain itself, and then there's a part of us that's wiser that collectively wants to wake up and is trying to, and the two are perpetually in conflict. I think that's been probably true for the whole of humanity.
I would agree. And I would say that collectively, especially over the last few years, it's been brewing for a while, but in the last few years, we're undergoing a collective dark night of the soul. There's a breakdown of the way things have been, and
Hmm.
hopefully, an emergence of something that where we've learned from it.
Yeah.
And I think it's happening on multiple levels in multiple ways, and then there's some ways in which we are dealing with it very unskillfully. Because when the dark night of the soul happens, we tend to revert back to our most primitive and immature ways of dealing with things. Like when that rage comes, we tend to want to act it out
Hmm. Yeah.
or
Or
internalize it.
I was just going to say, yeah, or turn it internally and then go into a depression, which is always my tendency. But and I think, hmm, I don't know how significant the differences are between being in a male body or a female body and encountering these dynamics. But it might have been different for you as far as that rage and anger wanting to be externalized in sort of a stereotypically male, powerful expression, as opposed to what women, or at least I personally did, which was turn it, against myself and blame myself for the
Yep.
way I was feeling. So,
I do think I wouldn't necessarily say there's a vast difference between men and women, but I would definitely say there's a vast difference between those who are masculine in their nature and feminine
hmm.
in their nature,
Hmm.
because and you can see that psychologically, like women who tend to be more feminine tend to score higher in realms psychologically of like agreeableness,
Hmm.
and men tend to score less so. And so a woman who's agreeable will often do things to go along and end up betraying herself,
Hmm.
right? And then
Yeah,
end up
yeah.
sort of angry as a result of betraying herself because of that high degree of agreeableness, which women need in order, well, basically to raise children, for one.
Hmm. That's a good
I
point.
mean,
Yeah.
you have to be agreeable I mean, otherwise you murder your child.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but sorry, I don't mean to be so
That's
so
okay. I
somber
know.
about that, but
I
or
know what you
so
mean.
so flippant. But you're right. And so for men, there is a real need to adopt a mentality of sovereignty and true authority in order to be a proper man and care for the world.
Hmm.
And so that struggle for power is usually a more externalized one.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I would definitely agree with you on that, that there is some kind of difference.
And I'm sure it's quite a tricky thing being a man in this world because I mean, I have sympathy for you guys because you you're in an impossible position in a lot of ways, especially in contemporary times where you're expected to be powerful and command all of the things we typically associate with masculinity, or old style masculinity anyway. And yet there's this strain that's demanding that you also be tender and I don't know,
Yes.
introspective and much
Yeah.
more in touch with your inner life and femininity. And I think that trips a lot of guys up, at least from what I observe. And I'm sure so that for you, I'm guessing, tell me if I'm wrong, but that is probably a particular kind of integration that you would encounter as you're going through Dark Night as a man.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like as a spiritually oriented man, I think that's very true. Thank you for recognizing that. Um, and it's very confusing for men. And the one thing I hear from virtually all men I work with or meet on this path is that there's a real absence of true models to show what
Yeah.
true masculinity is, what it is to be a man of power, a
Mhm.
man of knowledge, a man of strength and boldness, but also a man of intimacy and depth
Yeah.
and love. And there is a place where they are synthesized, and that's what true masculinity really is.
Mhm.
There is no such thing as like, well, we're going to deviate from this topic if we go too far. But yes, Dark Night of the Soul is, I think, quite different between men and women. Now that you put it
Mhm.
that way, I think that's very true.
Mm.
A lot of that is going to be a result of our misunderstandings about what masculine and feminine really are. A lot of that is going to be the confusion sociologically in what's
Yeah.
happening, because there's a lot of movements where men are being encouraged toward a kind of false femininity and women are being encouraged toward a false masculinity,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
there's great imbalance that erupts. And so when a person is waking up, going through these transitional phases of development, they confront these aspects of their conditioning, and it's really confusing and hard,
Mhm.
especially if they don't have proper guidance.
Yes.
I wanted to circle back at some point in our conversation to what you started with in the beginning, which is, what is the relationship between ordinary depression and the dark night of the soul?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
Because I think there's some very clear places of demarcation, and then there's some places where it's not so clear what the
Mhm.
difference actually is. Because there's definitely, let's be honest, there's definitely within most dark nights of the soul periods of very deep depression,
Mhm.
very, very deep depression. And they can occur in very psychological ways. For example, a person, what they've constructed in their life as meaningful is
Mhm.
breaking down, and now they don't feel anything as meaningful,
Mhm.
right? And so that can be depressing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then there's other forms where, you've tasted divine joy, bliss, love, and you've known it for a period of time. You know how real it is,
Mhm.
and then it seems to be absent. It seems to be gone. And
Yes.
where did God go? Where did
Mhm.
the love go? Where did the bliss go? And no matter what you do, you can't find it. You can't retrieve it. And so there's a deep depression that sets in at having tasted something so profound and so beautiful, and now feeling so lost, so disconnected. Where did God go? And they're not, I don't think any of these things are separable entirely, but we have to acknowledge that for the person who is truly undergoing a spiritual dark night of the soul, it's not just depressing because I can't find something to stimulate myself, or I don't feel inspired, I don't feel motivated. Those things happen in the dark night of the soul, but they're with much greater consequence, much greater intensity.
Yeah, there's a sense of utter abandonment as you
Yes.
were describing that. That was the feeling I was getting. Abandonment, emptiness. I recall a deep sense of worthlessness. We talked about that a few times, I think. What? what worth do I have if I'm
Yeah.
nothing? And also a sense of regret over having wasted my life.
But all of this is to facilitate what the Christians call the mystical poverty, to bring about this deep emptiness of the soul that is completely ready for God's presence.
Yeah, because once you empty it all out, then you begin to fill it back up. Well, you don't
Yes.
begin to fill it up, but
Yeah.
God fills it up.
Good. Yes, truth fills it. Love fills it. Right. That's the important distinction. Going back to something you said earlier, is when that deconstruction happens, we want to reify. We want to put ourselves back together, regather those reference points. And when we're in the awakening process, that's not possible at a certain point, and it's truth that has
Hmm.
to fill the cup now.
Yeah. Sorry, I got a little choked up there.
That's okay. That's okay. This is a very emotional process, and it's a very emotional subject because anyone who's gone through this journey has known the deep pain and sorrow and regret and shame and guilt and depression and all those things that come in the dark night. It's painful, painful beyond belief.
I think that as you deconstruct all of the big things we've been talking about, like the sense of our identity that's invested in all the things society tells us we have to do and be in order to be quote unquote good or successful, as those things, tumble to the ground, and that space opens up, that yawning chasm, that abyss of identity that we once thought we had filled. What can begin to happen in that space is an attention to, or an experience of, tiny insignificant things, um, that you might not have noticed before, and you see the profound and immense beauty and truth in those things. I wrote that poem one time about a hummingbird. I looked at a
Mm,
hummingbird out the window one day, and I was just absolutely struck by how magnificent it was, this tiny little thing,
mm,
just sort of buzzing around, and what it expressed about reality to me. And there was just, this tiny little experience that lasted about 10 seconds, and it spoke of the universe. And
uh-huh.
that's not something I would have been attuned to or able to perceive had I still been mired in all of my egoic perceptions of
Yeah.
myself or reality or um,
Yes.
life in general.
Yes. Yes. It brings to mind, yes, so much what you're saying. It brings to mind, speaking of what comes about, and speaking of how difficult this is, I would consider myself someone who came into spiritual work without having a kind of healthy, well integrated ego,
Hmm.
and having, so I refer to that as like a structure. Not having a solid, healthy ego structure because of things that I, grew up with, and things that were obstacles on my path to proper development, makes the breakdown more difficult.
Hmm.
And, like a well structured ego will often be able to handle certain elements of disintegration a little more cleanly,
Hmm.
or maturely at least. And I notice in myself that the breakdowns that I've gone through in my life, because of that lack of structure from my early childhood, really made these dark nights significant. So I just want to take a moment to speak out to those individuals who have been through trauma and who've been through really difficult situations in their life, that they've taken up spiritual work, they've felt the calling, they're doing their work, and it's fucking hard. And because they weren't given the structure to navigate life in a really healthy way, the disintegration and the breakdown is especially difficult. So I just want to take a moment to recognize for those individuals the significant task that they're seeing to, and maybe here encourage them by saying you're on the right track, and
Yeah.
something good is unfolding here,
Hmm.
you know.
Yeah. I think sort of adjacent to the point you just made is the fact that we don't have any role models. We don't have any traditions in Western society that speak to this passage. There's no ceremonies, there's no celebration when you're on the other side. You probably don't even know what's coming at you until you're in it. And that in itself is disorienting. And so, thank God for community. Thank God for Sangha,
Yeah.
because we can look to each other for that support, for that encouragement while we're, in this incredibly, uh, I don't want to say stressful. I guess it is stressful. It can be a little debilitating while you're in it.
Yes, that's an important point. Sangha, to be
Yeah.
surrounded by people who know what it's like, the path, and who've been through some of the rigors, and who are there in wisdom and love to support the unfolding. Hmm.
Yeah, not just support, but also help us to interpret it
Hmm.
differently, because I know there have been many points where what I thought was pain wasn't pain. What I thought was depression wasn't depression. What I was experiencing was something much more complicated. I think I've described before experiencing grief and then realizing as I was in it that what I was actually experiencing was something very beautiful. That
Hmm.
it was sadness, but it wasn't a dark kind of, I don't know, desolation. It was actually something very pure and full of love, but it just hurt. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And it's something I might not have been able to discover on my own had I not had the influences of
Yep.
community.
Yep. Speaking of community, yeah, it reminds me of I've worked a little bit in the addictions realm, and um, looking at AA. There's something very beautiful about AA, because it's, in some sense, it's based on the very knowledge that it's the dark night of the soul that brings you to the path. It's by
Yeah.
hitting rock bottom, right?
Mhm.
It's by going into the worst possible places of hell
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
you begin to wake up, and that you begin to take that upward journey, that ascent. And and what you see in AA is really beautiful. Is you see this community of people who've been they've been there,
Mhm.
they've been through it, they know what the person is going through, and they're saying, and they know the way out,
Yeah.
or the way,
Yeah.
as they say, not out but through.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. AA is very much a kind of a parallel path
Yes, it is.
to what we do, and there is a spiritual component that underpins it.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a member, but I have been to meetings, and
Yep.
yeah, yeah, that
Yep.
dynamic is very. And what I think is important there too is the absence of judgment. If you're practicing the 12 steps, you're setting your ego aside. It's very deliberately being diverted
Yep.
and set out of the way so that you can do
Yep.
the work. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a great deal of acceptance in that
Mhm.
community, and love and support. Hmm.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about the gifts of the dark night of the soul, that the dark night of the soul leaves you compassionate, it leaves you loving, it leaves you clear, it
Mhm.
leaves you feeling whole, connected. I mean, when we go through a dark night, it's it's in the it's in the dawn that follows that we realize how important and precious that dark night was.
Absolutely. That's the deliverance
Yes.
until the
Yes.
next one.
Yeah. Yeah, until the next one. Right. And then the next one is going to break open, so an even brighter dawn will reveal. And
Yeah.
that's the dimensional part I was speaking of, is that each your consciousness moves to a new dimension of awareness, and you have new experiences, and you have new knowledge and insight, and you operate in a new way. And then even that becomes its own place that has to be gone beyond. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
then, even in that, like, even when you arrive at the heart chakra, even when your heart is split wide open and all you feel is love and connectedness and unity and compassion and sensitivity, you'll realize that at a certain point, even that has to go. Not
Mm.
go permanently, but it's not the whole story. And so
Right.
there will be a breakdown of that state. And it's like, we don't want to lose that love and connectedness and unity and compassion, and yet we can feel it vanishing, and we don't know why. It doesn't feel right that it should vanish, and yet there's a dimensional shift to another level of consciousness that's necessitating that. And each dimensional shift that way will come with a real hardship and a real like sense that there's territory that you've gained and now you're losing it.
Mm, yeah. And I remember you saying, that God is in the losing as well.
Ah, yes.
Um, but it just speaks to, like like you say, it hasn't gone anywhere. It's always there. It's almost, you may not be experiencing that particular sensation, but it's implied. It's
Yes.
already part of the experience, and now we're just adding something more immense within which to contextualize it.
That's a mature understanding, what you just presented, because if a person can hear that and remember it, that when you begin to move, let's say, into a new dimension and you start to lose that feeling of unity and love and connectedness, you're not really losing it. It's
Right.
only that you're unfolding something that will be even bigger, more expansive, but will, as you come to know, it will include what you've already experienced.
Right. Right.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. Such as the rigors of growth and expansion.
Indeed.
Yeah.
That might be a good spot to wrap this up.
I think it is. I think
All
it is.
right.
This has been a delightful subject to explore with you.
Yeah. Yeah. It was. It was very, very, oof, profound. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Into the Mystery. A special shout out to our listener Clara, who suggested the topic for this episode. If you have a topic you'd like to hear us cover or have any questions, please visit one of our websites. Adi's is adivajra.org, that's adivajra.org, or mine at interdimensionalyoga.com. And if you're interested in joining us for a special monthly transmission, guided meditation, and spiritual chat, then please go to our Patreon page for details. There's a link to that in the text that accompanies this episode. Thanks again for listening.